In the Bronx, in New York, on New Year's Eve in 2006, the tragic demise of a professional welterweight boxer broke the hearts of his family, friends, and the community. The person responsible was able to evade the police for 18 years, until one day when he was caught and brought to justice. Kemal Kolenovic was a boxer that loved the fighting life even though the pay and benefits were not always great. At the age of 28, his 9 years career record was fairly unremarkable with 10 victories, 6 losses, and 2 draws. According to a friend, Kemal was an all-out brawler, not much of a technical boxer, but he always had a blast just throwing punches, and he was good at it. His friend also said that it was hard for him to get fights with his style. He made his opponents look stupid. On December 31st, 2006, Kemal lost his life after a barroom brawl in which the police said he had not participated. Sometime after 4:30 a.m., he was run over by a man driving a sports utility vehicle. The man was fleeing the Moonlight restaurant and bar on Belmont Avenue, where he and others had argued over which Albanian surnames were most associated with tougher and generally superior people. The men had taken the fight outside. Kemal, who was at the Moonlight with an uncle, Tony Mujovic, had eventually followed them onto the sidewalk and joined a group that had gathered perhaps just to see what was going on, or perhaps to try to get them to break it up. One of the men climbed into a dark sport utility vehicle and plowed into the crowd. He hit Kemal with his car. That threw Kemal headfirst into a tree and fled the scene and disappeared to the Balkans in Eastern Europe. The EMS responded and took him to St. Barnabas Hospital, where he was pronounced deceased shortly after. On the surveillance footage that was recovered from the scene, Kemal can be seen with his hand in his pockets, wanting to go home. His back was towards the Mitsubishi SUV. He did not stand a chance, as he did not see the car coming. The case into Kemal's slaying went cold, as the man responsible for Kemal's demise could not be found for 18 years. Early in 2024, the Bronx DA's office issued an international red notice arrest warrant, and U.S. Marshals joined forces with local law enforcement in Kosovo, Serbia, to finally apprehend 42-year-old Ahmet Gashi. Gashi was then picked up by the Serbian police and was transferred to the ward of the U.S. Marshals. The police identified Gashi as a suspect within days of the slaying. On December 13, 2024, he arrived at Central Booking in the Bronx. He was charged with second-degree slaying. Kemal's best friend, Elvir Murici, hopes the arrest of the suspect after 18 years will bring some solace to the victim's family. He said, "When they hear the news, I am sure they will be relieved a little bit. They are not bringing nothing back, to be honest, but at the same time, it will make them feel better." For nearly 5 decades, a notorious slaying case has plagued Australian detectives until the perpetrator was finally arrested. On January 13, 1977, best friends Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett from Collingwood, Victoria, were found lifeless in their home on Easy Street in Melbourne, Australia. Suzanne had been stabbed 27 times and was also assaulted. Her then 16-month-old son was left unharmed and had been unattended in his cot when the police located their bodies. Susan was found face down near the front door with 55 stab wounds and showed signs of self-defense and attempts to escape. The bathtub and towels near the back of the house showed evidence that the perpetrator had attempted to clean up before leaving via the back door. There were no signs of forced entry, though a footprint on the front windowsill indicated a possible entry point. The kitchen light was left on, and the weapon was not found. The 2 friends were last seen alive on the evening of January 10th. DNA was collected from the scene and stored, but the case, dubbed the Easy Street slayings, unfortunately went cold. 40 years later, in 2017, Victoria Police had offered a $1 million reward to solve the double slaying case after a re-investigation of the case. Suzanne's sister, Gail Armstrong, said that the reward was well overdue. She said, "The reward would bring relief. It is half a lifetime we have lost. Here is $1 million. Just say something." There was a person of interest in the case, and he agreed to provide a DNA sample. But then he fled the country, and the police were not able to find him. A DNA test on a family member then matched him to samples taken from the crime scene of the brutal slaying of Suzanne and Susan. The case went cold again, as he could not be located. The breakthrough finally came 7 years later. The detectives found out that accused double perpetrator and offender, 65-year-old Perry Kouroumblis, had been living in Greece since 2017. Kouroumblis could not be arrested while he was in Greece, due to the country's 20-year statute of limitation on initiating slaying charges. So, undercover officers lured him to Rome. In late November 2024, 3 of Victoria's most senior detectives landed in the Italian capital 16,000 kilometers from where the crimes took place in 1977. The historic, majestic, and famous city of Rome would be the last place the Victoria police would have thought their biggest breakthrough would happen in possibly their state's most infamous, baffling, and brutal cold case slaying. After the breakthrough arrest, Victorian Police Commissioner Shane Patton described the case as an absolutely gruesome, horrific, frenzied slaying. He said, "For over 47 years, detectives from the squad have worked tirelessly to determine who was responsible for taking the lives of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett. This was a crime that struck at the heart of our community, 2 women in their own home, where they should have felt their safest." Patton also recognized the enduring resilience of both the Armstrong and Bartlett families, who have grieved for over 4 decades, and no doubt this will be a very emotional time for them. The Kouroumblis family lived on Bendigo Street, less than 300 meters away from the house where the 2 women were slain. Kouroumblis was 17 years old at the time and was a student at the same school where Susan worked as an arts and crafts teacher. In the weeks after the slayings, Kouroumblis was stopped by Ron Iddles, who was then a junior police officer, but went on to be one of the most respected detectives in Victoria police history. Kouroumblis was said to have an alibi for the day the women lost their lives. On December 2nd, 2024, Kouroumblis boarded a commercial Qatar Airways flight from Rome to Doha. He was the first to board the Boeing 787 and was seated at the back of the aircraft. There were 2 detectives seated next to him, and in front of him sat the boss of Victoria's detective squad, Dean Thomas. When the plane touched down, everyone on board exited the aircraft, but Kouroumblis was the last to get off. He was kept in a holding cell before boarding the 13.5-hour flight to Melbourne. When the plane finally landed in Melbourne, Kouroumblis was, this time, the first to exit flanked by the officers. He was then formally questioned over the alleged slayings of best friends, Suzanne and Susan. Kouroumblis will formally be charged with 2 counts of slaying and 1 count of assault during his next court appearance. Suzanne's sister Gail has spent every day waiting for news of the arrest. She said, "I just thought one day. One day. The police were so persistently consistent, I knew that it would happen one day." More than 44 years after a nursing student was slain in her trailer home in central Kansas, a person close to home was sentenced for ending her life. In 1980, Mary Robin Walter was a 23-year-old mother, wife, and a nursing school student. On January 24th, she was shot multiple times in her Great Bend trailer home in Kansas, and her body was found by her husband. The police found a .22 caliber handgun at the scene and confirmed that it was the weapon that was used to end Mary's life. Mary's 25-year-old neighbor was a suspect early on in the case, but the case went cold just 2 years into the investigation when the detectives failed to find any evidence to tie him to the case. The case remained untouched until more than 4 decades later in 2022, when a detective persuaded Barton County Sheriff Brian Bellendier to reopen the case and use new technology and techniques that were not available at the time. The detectives re-interviewed the initial suspect, Stephen L. Hanks, who by that time had spent a decade in prison for assault, battery, robbery, and burglary. He finally admitted to ending the life of Mary, but the authorities did not reveal his motive. Mary's daughter, Pamela Walter Cooper, said that although there was finally an arrest, she does not feel any different. She already forgave the suspect years ago. She said, "I already knew who did it. I knew that he was not convicted of it, but we knew who did it. We knew it was Stephen Hanks, the neighbor." Hanks formally pleaded guilty in August 2024 as part of a plea agreement that called for a sentence of not less than 5 years and not more than 25 years. The district court judge, however, raised the minimum to 10 years during the sentencing hearing. On September 12, 2024, 70-year-old Hanks got his sentence of 10 to 25 years in prison for second-degree slaying. The sheriff said that they believe it is the oldest cold case in Kansas to be solved and result in a conviction. Sheriff Bellendier said, "It bothers me that many of the people who were so affected by this tragic crime have since passed away prior to bringing the suspect to justice. I consider myself fortunate that I had the resources and the diligent personnel to close this case. The credit for solving this slaying goes to the dedicated officers that had the tenacity to bring it to a conviction." Pamela, Mary's daughter, said, "I think my dad would be relieved. I just hope that he, Hanks, is sorry for what he has done, that he is remorseful." In 2017, a beloved father and restaurant owner lost his life one night while he was at his restaurant in Pennsylvania. The person responsible managed to evade justice for 6 years before enough evidence could be gathered against him, and he was prosecuted. 58-year-old Robert Barron Sr., the owner of Gigerelli's Pizza in Old Forge, Pennsylvania, was last seen at around 10:30 p.m. on January 25, 2017, after he took his son Robert Barron Jr. home from work and then returned to the restaurant on South Main Street. The next day, it was apparent that a violent assault took place at his restaurant and he was reported as missing. The police responded to the restaurant where they found evidence from what they believed to be a brutal attack. There was spattered blood, broken glass, and a human tooth in the utility sink. They also found a looted cash register, an empty safe, and signs that someone tried to clean the place up. 2 days later, Robert's car was located in the 100 block of Howard Street with DNA on the steering wheel belonging to Robert and another male. There was not enough DNA collected in the sample to identify who the other man was. During an interview with Robert Jr., the police asked him if he knew of anyone who would want to hurt his father, and he immediately said Justin Schuback. Robert Jr. and Justin were friends, and Justin was an illegal substance user who knew Robert Sr. had large sums of cash in his restaurant. The police went to Justin's home, where he denied knowing anything about Robert's disappearance. The investigators searched several properties, including Justin's auto and towing company, owned by Justin's first cousin. The investigators also learned that Justin owed money to his illegal substance dealer. However, shortly after midnight on January 26, 2017, Justin allegedly paid his illegal substance debt in full and bought another 11 bags of substances for $180. As the police pressed on, suspicion of Justin grew. His girlfriend at the time, Courtney Rake, told them he left the house on January 25, 2017, between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. He did not answer calls and text messages for hours and only returned home, out of breath, with shoes covered in mud, around 3 a.m. Justin told Courtney that he had been hiding out from the police because he had substances on him. He cleaned himself up, took the substances, and went to bed. The police continued to investigate the case, but could not find the body or evidence leading to a suspect. The case had little movement until 6 years later, in March 2023. Advancements in forensics and cell tower analysis helped break the case and provide a timeline of Justin's movements the day Robert went missing. Justin Schuback's phone records showed that he was at Gigerelli restaurant between 12:39 a.m. and 1:45 a.m. He headed south at 1:56 a.m. and was then pinged at Pagnotti Park between 2:01 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. The data helped lead the police to discovering Robert Sr.'s remains at Pagnotti Park. The range to tower information also showed Schuback's phone around Connell Street, where a witness first saw Robert's Hyundai, and then on Howard Street, where the authorities ultimately found the vehicle. Those findings led to Schuback's arrest, and during his questioning, investigators pressed him for a confession. Schuback, however, repeatedly denied that he ended Robert's life. About a half hour into the interview, Schuback said that he wanted a lawyer, but the questioning continued anyway. Schuback had a different story for his cellmate in the Lackawanna County Prison. His cellmate gave him some Suboxone, a buprenorphine and naloxone cocktail meant to ease opioid withdrawal symptoms. The detectives claimed that it was done to interrogate Schuback while he was under the influence. Schuback said, I did it." According to court filings, Schuback disclosed that he planned to burglarize the restaurant and steal money. He did not anticipate that Robert Sr. would be there, and the two got into an argument that escalated. Schuback said that he racked Robert with a metal object and he fell lifeless on the ground. He then cleaned the restaurant and drove Robert's body to a park to dispose of the remains. He gathered incriminating evidence into bags and a suitcase and burned it outside of the county. The trial began May 6, 2024. The prosecution rested the following Monday on May 13th. Schuback did not take the stand and no defense witnesses were called. Jurors found Schuback guilty after deliberating for about 10 hours over 2 days. His first-degree slaying conviction carries an automatic life sentence, but Judge Terrence Nealon needed to hand down separate sentences for the burglary and robbery charges. Schuback was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus a consecutive sentence of 7.5 to 15 years in prison for robbery and burglary. 11 days later, on May 24th, a wrongful demise civil suit was filed in county court by Robert's daughter, Brittany Barron, acting as administrator of his estate without an attorney. The suit asks for liens to be placed on 2 properties owned by Schuback to prevent them from being transferred or sold before the suit is adjudicated. His home at 3 Foundry Street, Old Forge, and 1.09 acres of land on Miller Street in the borough. County property and deed records appear to indicate that the properties are one and the same. A single-family home on 1.09 acres, which was transferred to Schuback by his mother in 2021, the summer before she passed away. That home is a short distance from Pagnotty Park and the densely wooded area where Robert's skeletal remains were discovered in early 2023. It is also where 38-year-old Schuback was arrested in March of that year. District Attorney Powell stated in a press conference that no one in law enforcement ever gave up trying to solve this mystery. They sincerely hope that the Barron family can begin to start to move forward and find some relief and closure. He went on to commend the efforts of all of the investigative teams, including the FBI, Old Forge detectives, and the Pennsylvania State Police. In 1976, Pauline Brazeau, a single mother, was last seen leaving a restaurant in Calgary, Canada. Her body was found soon after, but the case would only be solved after almost 4 decades. 16-year-old Pauline Elizabeth Brazeau was a young Métis woman who moved to Calgary, Canada from Yorkton, Saskatchewan, with her older sister, Nancy. Pauline grew up in a small house in Yorkton with 8 other people, her parents, her siblings, and 2 cousins her parents took in when her aunt passed away. She was also a single mother to a little girl. On January 8, 1976, Pauline was having drinks at her aunt's apartment in Calgary's West End. She left to get pizza with a friend. After finishing up, they took off, but Pauline could not find her gloves. She tried to retrace her steps, headed back to the pizza place, turned up nothing, and left again. About 5 hours later, she was found partially clothed with multiple stab wounds on a forestry road outside of Calgary. An autopsy would determine that her life was taken. According to Nancy, Pauline's sister, Pauline was outgoing, friendly, and just a normal kid. Her cousin Roy said that she was stunning. He said, "She was a beautiful girl. Boy, oh, she was a wonderful-looking girl." Due to the lack of advanced DNA technology, the case went cold. Her case stayed cold until 45 years later. In 2021, Alberta RCMP's Historical Slaying Unit partnered with Calgary Police Service's Cold Case Slaying Unit to reanalyze files. Dating back to the 1970s, with advancements in DNA technology, investigative genetic genealogy was used to identify leads. The next year, in 2022, the Historical Slaying Unit sought aid from Othram and then worked with 2 dedicated genealogists from Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy, coming up with a suspect in 2023. On November 7th, 74-year-old Ronald James Edwards of Alberta, Canada was arrested and charged with non-capital slaying as defined by the Criminal Code at the time. The RCMP does not believe that Pauline knew Edwards, and he is not being linked to any other slayings of the era. Edwards has a criminal history. In 1989, he pleaded guilty to attempted slaying and assault of an 18-year-old woman. According to news stories written by the Calgary Herald and the Canadian Press at the time, Edwards attacked the young woman with a knife. The judge who sentenced him to 10 years in prison commented that the victim likely saved her own life by escaping through a window at the time. The arrest came about 20 years since Pauline's father last heard from an officer about his daughter's case. Pauline's mother has passed away since, but neither her father nor her sister is disappointed in the police work. They know a lot of time has passed, and they believe that the police did everything they could at the time. The officer in charge, Inspector Brian Brown, said that the Alberta RCMP Historical Slaying Unit investigators are committed to speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves, and that the search for Pauline's perpetrator has never ended over the past 47 years. Throughout the years, they remained hopeful that the person responsible would one day be held accountable. Inspector Brienne said that she is extremely grateful for all investigators who have worked on this investigation throughout the years and the partnership and support from the Calgary Police Service. Edwards made his initial court appearance in Calgary on November 14th, although he was not physically present in the courtroom. He is set to appear before a judge and jury on March 3rd, 2025. A man was found deceased inside his home in Oklahoma, but the police only made an arrest nearly 20 years later. On July 17, 2006, Ervin Dwight Tolon was found with a fatal gunshot wound inside his home near North St. Louis Avenue and Virgin in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The police found illegal substances at the scene and believed that may have been the motive for the slaying. The detectives interviewed the neighbors, followed up on leads, and collected evidence. But despite all efforts, the case turned cold. 18 years later, in 2024, the case was reopened. In November and December, the detectives talked with several witnesses and received new information that identified Bryant Gamble as a suspect in the case. On December 10th, 2024, he was arrested for first-degree slaying and was booked into the Tulsa County Jail. Gamble was previously released from prison in February 2024 after serving more than 16 years for a 2007 robbery conviction. In 1988, an assault took place in northern Arizona. The arrest would only happen decades later. Thanks to the advancements in DNA technology, this case has seen the light at the end of the tunnel. On December 16, 1988, a woman was working as a clerk at a gas station in Pinetop, Arizona, when a man forced her into a vehicle and took her to a remote area of Lakeside. The man then violently assaulted her and left her in the woods. The woman was able to find a nearby home and she called 911. A lot of work was done in the 80s, but they were limited by the technology back then. DNA evidence could be tested in 1988, but the sample had to be much larger than today. Pinetop Lakeside Police said that the case had been reviewed several times through the years, but had no solid leads and unfortunately went cold. However, 33 years after the crime happened, in 2024, recent advancements in DNA testing helped identify the suspect in this case as Thomas Duke. The lucky break in the case happened because the evidence collection was done so well in 1988. Duke was not previously on the investigators' radar for this crime. Duke was arrested while at his job in Maricopa County. He was extradited to Navajo County, where a grand jury indicted him on charges of kidnapping, assault, and abuse. The Navajo County Attorney's Office is pursuing a criminal prosecution of Duke. He had previously served just over 6 years in an Arizona prison in the late 70s and early 80s for 2 assaults and an attempted assault. The investigators are building a case against him to get closure for the victims. Detective Bunch said that he was relieved to get a break in the case, a feeling he says was also felt by the victim. He said, "I think it was a pretty big surprise when I contacted her, but, hopefully now that she knows who did this, and it is going to go through the court process, which unfortunately can take a while, she can get some closure at the end of it."